Hi, and welcome to another edition of Dad's Divorce Live. I'm Matt Allen, editor of DadsDivorce.com. Today I'm joined by Edward Kruk, an associate professor of social work at the University of British Columbia, who has been studying the changing role of fathers and the problems of father absence for 30 years. His latest book, Divorced Fathers, Children's Needs and Parental Responsibilities, illuminates the tragic toll on fathers first removed from their children's lives by a biased legal system and then unsupported by a social services network that is almost wholly indifferent to fathers' rights and feelings. Now you can learn more about Edward and his book by visiting his website, edwardkruk.com. So Edward, thanks again for joining me. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the invitation.
Now first off, regarding your research, when dads start to lose contact with their children, what are some of the lasting effects that has on a father?
Well, oddly, I expected fathers would be having by now a much better outcome because the federal Canadian government did stipulate that shared parenting would be its platform as far as child custody policy is concerned. That really hasn't come about. So sadly, the situation for fathers is worse today than it would have been 20 years ago, for example, when I completed a study for my doctoral degree looking at the impact of divorce on fathers and also the issue of father absence. And I had been studying that already for some time at that point. So what I note is that the grief reaction of fathers experienced related to the absence of their children in my first study 20 years ago is now more or less a full-blown post-traumatic stress reaction. Right. And with great effects on both mentally and physically on fathers and, of course, their children as well, which is, a major concern when we discuss the best interest of the child in divorce-related situations.
And this, we've seen studies linking this PTSD to this sort of phenomenon of fathers' absence. Now, you've called the absence of fathers one of the most significant and powerful trends of this generation. Why do you feel that way?
Well, I think it's just the sheer magnitude of the degree of father absence. It seems fathers are being pushed out of their children's lives from a number of sources, particularly the child custody system. But it's not only, of course, fathers. Some mothers get caught up in it, too. So I don't see it as an exclusively gender-based problem. Okay. There are non-custodial mothers as well. But nevertheless, the majority are non-custodial parents or fathers, and they're really at a very vulnerable situation in that regard, still in Canada. But it's a significant trend and a powerful trend, the absence of fathers. Just when one looks at the whole question of the effects of father absence, the recent study I came across by a developmental psychologist, Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen, recently published a study of the whole issue of lack of empathy in people, in children, and he found that if a child lives in a situation of parental abuse or neglect, there's a greater chance of that child developing low empathy, and just the whole area of moral development. And it seems that that kind of father absence that results from parental alienation is a form of child abuse, because you're basically transmitting to the child the notion that somehow they're defective in some way, because the child believes both parents, that a child believes that he or she is half the mother and half the father, and if you kind of derogate one side of that, such as fathers, then you're really derogating the child. It becomes a situation of almost self-hatred in the child. I call it a significant trend, and it's a powerful trend because it's affecting so many children and families, father absence, and seems to be so closely associated with any number of social problems, direct result of our child custody policies, child protection policies, And even child care policies, we don't really provide support to parents to the degree that they really require to address their children's needs. They're not really meeting their responsibility in that regard.
Yeah, and that's not just limited to Canada, of course. Do you feel that these I guess, policies or institutions or courts are promoting sort of a form of parental alienation by virtually removing a parent from a child's life through sole physical custody decisions?
Yes, I think to the degree that the courts do remove capable and loving parents from children's lives via sole custody decrees, that is one form of alienation of a child from a parent, and that is of great concern. It's a social policy that seems to be tailor-made almost to producing emotional difficulties in children that disconnect from their parents. So there's a lot of rhetoric that's changing, but I don't know if there's very much evidence really to support any evidence of change.
Now, finally, you argue for a shift away from a rights-based discourse to a framework of responsibility to needs. What do you mean by that?
Well, the problems with an exclusively rights-based framework, which we seem to really value, and there is a place for children's rights, of course, and we do have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I think is an almost sacred document. But I think we have to go beyond rights to discussing responsibilities to children's needs. We talk about the best interest of the child. It's almost never defined in legislation. It's very difficult to define, and it's probably individual for each child. But nevertheless, when we really have to define that term, the best interest of the child. I think they're very much connected with children's needs. I guess that's what an exclusively rights-based framework perhaps doesn't address that directly. It almost diverts us from a focus on our responsibilities to children's needs, both parental responsibilities to children's needs, but also social institutional responsibilities in regard to supporting parents to be responsible and responsive to their children's needs. So that's my problem with a rights-based framework fundamentally. But the bottom line is that the state, our social institutions, don't support parents in the fulfillment of their parental responsibilities, and therefore children's needs and interests aren't being addressed. I also think it's very important to support parental authority in children's lives. They are primarily responsible to address their children's needs, and the state should be there in a supportive capacity, not an obstructive capacity, as at present, when the courts, for example, remove a parent from the life of a child. Children of divorce are subject to a very ambiguous, vague standard. It's called the best interest of the child, and of course, who can argue that that should be the reigning principle? However, I think it's open to debate who makes that decision. Should it be the best interest of the child from the perspective of the child or perspective of a third-party so-called authority, a judge, who is making decisions without a foundation of child development or family dynamics training or knowledge? And we're getting these problematic outcomes. So I'd like to see institutions like the courts, the child welfare system, and social security system really take on this responsibility to needs orientation, meaning that recognize the responsibilities of social institutions to support parents in their role as responsible for their children's well-being and their children's needs and interests.
Sure. Well, Edward, I want to thank you for your time and continued success with your research and with your book.
That's great. Okay, Matt. Well, thanks again.
That was Edward Kruk. You can learn more about him and his new book, Divorced Fathers, Children's Needs and Parental Responsibilities, again, by visiting his website, edwardkruk.com. That'll do it for this edition of Dad's Divorce Live. I'm Matt Allen, editor of DadsDivorce.com.